Most people think of Iggy Pop immediately when they hear the name of the Stooges, a band that is frequently said to have been the punk rock Nirvana. Sexy, unbridled, and wailing within a tumultuous mass as though attempting to engulf the entire planet. However, there was an additional man who remained aloof from the limelight, and who neither sang nor shouted. Ron Asheton was simply slumped over his guitar, allowing it to do the talking. He never fit the mold of a conventional rock star. Absence of drug-induced mischief, tabloid controversies, and popular struggles for fairness. To alter the course of modern music irrevocably, Ron Asheton subtly built riffs that were basic yet eerie, noises that bellowed, hefty, and primordial. Still, his own band ignored him and let him fade into oblivion for 30 years. And died in peace, undiscovered, in a house that was deserted. What transpired? Why did the man who created rock music fail to make it into the canon? What is it in him that continues to elicit the admiration of subsequent generations, who refer to him as the silent riff genius? This goes beyond the tale of a guitarist. It's the low, ringing bell of an unyielding spirit, the sound of a punk legend who was never one to perform on a grand platform. Is the final remnant of a man who never sought approval for his very existence. Ron Asheton was his name. Perhaps now is the moment to hear it for the first time if you have never done so. Earlier years. A member of a military family, Ron Asheton entered this world at the nation's capital on July 17, 1948. U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Ronald F. Asheton Sr. was his father. His mother, Eleanor Dorsey, was a mild-mannered Irish-American housewife who kept the peace and discipline in the family during all of their moves after World War II. Moving from one state to another was a constant feature of Ron's childhood. The Asheton family resided in temporary army housing when Ron and his brother Scott were growing up because their father was in the military. Neither of them ever really felt at home or made any real friends throughout their time there. As a result of all the upheaval, Ron became an introverted, thoughtful young man with a serious expression on his face belying his years. There was nowhere to settle down, and no one I could stay in touch with for very long. Ron learned to befriend himself at a young age. In that isolated place, there were two things that gave him a sense of vitality. In the context of rock music and conflict. Beginning with basic surf rock and blues chords, he eventually developed his own style after falling in love with guitar at the age of 11. Simultaneously, he grew up in the shadow of his uniformed, dominating father, which explains his strange fixation on military themes. As an integral part of his persona, he donned army jackets frequently, studied battle strategies, collected vintage military equipment, and made pencil maps of battlefields. After his father retired, the family finally made their home in Ann Arbor, Michigan. In that place, Ron started to broaden his horizons, not just with books on the war, but also with amplifiers, electric guitars, and the growling sound of British rock bands like The Who, the Yardbirds, and the Rolling Stones. The individuals who would have the greatest impact on his life were also persons he met in Ann Arbor. Two young men, James Osterberg, later known as Iggy Pop, and Dave Alexander, shared Ron's restless dissatisfaction with the proper and organized environment in which they grew up. Nobody could have foreseen that the young man who had quietly traversed half of the country, bearing the intangible marks of isolation and military discipline, would one day contribute to the formation of the most defiant kind of music that has ever been. Yet that is precisely what Ron Asheton accomplished. During their early career, they played guitar with calloused hands and a heart that never learnt to ask for forgiveness. Rock music in the late 1960s was about fury, anarchy, and the urge to break down all boundaries, not about sounding pleasant anymore. Ann Arbor was a refuge for young people escaping the stifling atmosphere of post-war America. Under those circumstances, a band was formed by Ron Asheton, his younger brother Scott Asheton on drums, close friend Dave Alexander on bass, and James Osterberg, a former drummer eager to seize the microphone. No one could agree on a name for it. Nothing more than the fact that it sounded completely new was communicated to them. The Stooges was a moniker they chose because it was basic, uncomplicated, and even deliberately ridiculous. While James Osterberg's Iggy Pop writhed in quest of a performance style, writhing in blood, biting glass, and flinging himself to the floor, Ron Asheton stood silently behind his Gibson Les Paul guitar, playing mesmerizing, repetitive riffs. His music exuded tension, death, and riot. It wasn't beautiful or glamorous. It was hammer-heavy and distorted. On the first track of their 1969 first album, The Stooges, produced by John Cale, previously of the Velvet Underground, they showcased Ron's distinctive riff, which sounded like an engine roaring on a scorching July night. I Wanna Be Your Dog, however, was the showpiece. It was a song with only 3 repeated notes that threw the listener into an almost primal fury. Ron Asheton created a new guitar language in about 3 minutes. It was raw, violent, and blatantly antithetical to the musical norms of the day. The band's 1970 album Fun House was an even more disorienting foray into chaos, released the following year. Even with Steve McKay's frantic saxophone accompaniment, Ron remained the sound's driver. The Stooges had long since stopped performing musical numbers. A Dionysian rite of resounding drums, wild cries, and unrelenting fevered guitar was what they were offering. Many failed to notice that, contrary to their seemingly carefree persona, the Stooges, particularly Ron, exhibited remarkable self-control during rehearsals. He mapped out the frameworks of the songs, managed the harmonics, and ultimately determined the band's sound. The Stooges might have been nothing more than a passing fad had Ron not been involved. They were the pioneers of punk rock with Ron, although nobody had ever heard of the term punk before. After each outrageous performance, record labels pulled their support because the public deemed them insane. The band's fortunes plummeted after 2 albums bombed at the box office. Furthermore, the outside world was not the source of the most devastating blow. The man who had performed on stage with Ron before sent it. Iggy Pop would replace Ron Asheton, a co-creator of the role, with a new guitarist at their next recording session. When things got rough for Ron Asheton's career, the Stooges weren't simply a band. It was his sole guiding principle. Even though the world was going crazy with acid rock, progressive rock, and funk in the early 1970s, he stuck to his guns. Basic, repetitive riffs that sunk like whispered anger into the listener's skull. Ron's music was uncommercial and unconcerned with commercial standards. The Stooges' bass was something unpolished, vital, and genuine. It was a savage blow to Ron's music when Iggy Pop, out of the blue, suggested that James Williamson take up lead guitar duties for their 1973 album Raw Power. There was no briefing or gathering of the band members. David Bowie's influence and production advice led Iggy to seek a harder rock sound with glam overtones that was quicker and more aggressive. And Williamson rose to prominence thanks to his forceful stabbing riffs. Under the radar, the guy responsible for shaping the band's early sound, Ron Asheton, was relegated to bass. Is he injured? Yes. Taken aback? Sure thing. Ron, however, remained silent. Neither did he argue, resign, or resist. Rather than that, he took a step back, picked up a Fender Precision bass, and continued playing as if nothing had happened. However, his close associates detected a change. Ron withdrew, became hushier, and seemed distant. Not only was it painful to be replaced, but he was also being replaced inside the same thing he had contributed to being born. The album Raw Power was daring and controversial. Flamingo was James Williamson. Listening to Iggy Pop on tape was a nightmare. To Ron, though, these were not the Stooges he had known. He was nothing more than a background figure in this alien metamorphosis, and he found it unable to identify with it anymore. Raw Power was so confusing that not even the general populace understood it. Columbia Records mixed up Iggy's and Bowie's versions, which made for an inconsistent and distracting sound and led to low sales. Things went downhill even further while on tour. Scott, his younger brother, descended into despair behind the drums. Iggy struggled with heroin addiction. Williamson had conflicts with promoters. Ron became more distant, and Ron grew distant from the band. The Stooges formally broke up in. There was no public announcement, last performance, or dramatic split. Just like that, they stopped being present. As if they had never been. The individuals who had shook the very bedrock of the earth dispersed. Iggy Pop's famed and troubled solo career began at that point. It was a stepping stone to a career in production for James Williamson. It was a subtle vanishing off the radar for guitarist Ron Asheton, who had laid the groundwork for the raw punk sound with his bare hands. Nobody wanted to interview him. No record company wanted to put him on tour, and nobody even called. Instead of being remembered, Ron Asheton became an artifact, an outsider, and a forgotten pioneer. He remained on the periphery of rock and roll history for nearly 3 decades. There are no gripes or resentment. There is no one to blame. There is only the muted reverberation of a guitar and the life of a man who had dedicated himself to music, only to have history ignore him and his sacrifice. The ignored decades following the Stooges' 1974 breakup, Ron Asheton went through what he would later describe as a dark stretch that nobody paid attention to. There was no band, no record label, and no audience invitations. It appeared as though Ron disappeared from the rock and roll current, while Iggy Pop started to climb with David Bowie's help and James Williamson shifted into music production. For over 3 decades, there were no scandals or news stories, simply quiet. But that was no sign of capitulation. Instead of playing in stadiums, Ron continued performing in basements, little clubs, and experimental shows after moving back to Michigan. He became a part of the art rock group Destroy All Monsters in 1977. They combined elements of noise, punk, and visual performance. With members hailing from Detroit's underground and avant-garde scenes, the band was odd even by punk standards. Ron was able to continue working with Destroy All Monsters, even though it was never commercially successful. In this realm, recognition wasn't important. What mattered was creating sound that seemed authentic to him. Afterwards, he became a member of New Order, alternative band unconnected to the British Collective, and Dark Carnival, raucous lo-fi rock ensembles rooted in the harsh textures of Detroit. But none of these projects helped Ron regain his place in the music industry's spotlight. There was no public outcry, no publicity, and the musicians he had influenced had no idea what had become of him. Ron started playing little parts in low-budget horror flicks to make ends meet. He was frequently cast as monsters, mercenaries, or the lead actor who meets his demise first. He became a favorite of low-budget filmmakers thanks to his towering stature, intense stare, and frightening presence. He appeared in films such as Mosquito, 1995, Frostbiter, 1996, and Legion of the Night, 1997. Ron didn't have a major role in those movies. But, just like when he was on stage with the Stooges, he exuded an unassuming, unstoppable power. Unflappable, unwavering, and unyielding. During the 80s and 90s, when punk was at its peak and many artists, including Sonic Youth, Kurt Cobain, and Jack White, mentioned the Stooges as an inspiration, Ron Asheton was almost never mentioned in interviews, articles, or tribute albums. With Iggy Pop's specter hanging above them, Ron, whom he never let shine, was easy to lose sight of. Someone once asked him in Michigan if he ever felt he wished he had been as famous as Iggy. "Nah, I made that sound," Ron responded with a simple smile. "I'm satisfied." Living like Manor for nearly 30 years, Ron Asheton never complained, never gave up, never stopped playing guitar, and never lost touch with his roots. Lights were never necessary for him. All he needed was a guitar and an amplifier, that he could communicate with the world and let them know he was not quiet. However, little did he know, the door was about to swing open once more, and this time, his name would be heard all over the globe. Regrettably, it would permanently close shortly thereafter. Something that Ron Asheton had not anticipated started happening in the late 1990s, a late revival. A new generation of musicians began openly praising him as an inspiration, hailing from genres such as grunge, alternative, garage revival, and indie rock. Jack White, Nirvana, Sonic Youth, and Queens of the Stone Age all made simultaneous declarations. Without Ron Asheton and the Stooges, their music would be non-existent. The man who created punk rock in 1969 was still alive when the media started digging into the seedy history of Detroit rock, which shocked many. "I am still a musician residing in Ann Arbor who has yet to receive an invitation to perform on a major venue again." The Stooges didn't get back together until 2003, after almost 30 years of no communication. Mike Watt, Ron's longtime admirer and former Minutemen bassist who was asked to participate on Skull Ring, Iggy Pop's solo album, offered an unexpected idea that ignited the fire. Reuniting the Asheton brothers was Watt's suggestion. Though he was hesitant at first, Iggy eventually consented. The unimaginable occurred the moment they took the stage at Coachella in 2003. Standing there with his trusty Gibson Les Paul guitar in his hands, Ron Asheton finally cracked a smile after decades of hiding it. It was far from a rock star's cocky grin. It looked like the relieved grin of a man who had been forgotten but was suddenly remembered. He had always felt most at home in that very spot. Over the course of several years, the Stooges were fated on their reunion tour. They had evolved from the fringe group of the 1970s. As the punk rock veterans revered by a